Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be asking, does the Labour Party have a problem with anti-Semitism? And it's a warm welcome to the programme. And my guest on today's programme is Jed and Judith Ornstein. So welcome to the programme.
Hello, good to be here.
And it's very unusual to get a married couple on the programme. So I think this is the first for the Middle East Report. So you're very welcome on the programme. And you're here to talk about your book that you produced and also a documentary called Whitewashed Project, looking into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I'll start off with you, Judith. Can you share with us what it's like growing up in Britain as a Jewish woman and how you got involved, particularly with this Israeli advocacy?
Okay, I grew up in an area where there were no Jewish people. I felt quite marginalised, and it was at a time when I had to go into assembly, I had to join in with Christian forms of worship, but that's actually come in quite strongly now, because I find that I know quite a lot more about Christianity than many younger people today, which is very interesting. And I grew up, my father fought in the Second World War. I felt he was a hero. I still feel he was a hero. I used to parade round with his medals on. I felt nothing but British. I knew that the United Kingdom had given my family refuge in 1906. My grandparents came from Russia, and I looked on Britain as a haven of safety. It was post-Holocaust. Anti-Semitism didn't exist anymore. And suddenly, things have changed. And I used to not talk about politics because I felt I had no power. It seemed to go nowhere beyond if you sat at a dining room table. You might as well talk about who's going to be the new manager at Arsenal. You can't do anything about it. But I retired, social media came along, and I discovered that ordinary people like me could be empowered. And it's been wonderful, actually. And I found the voice that I had suppressed all those years because it felt frustrating suddenly came out. And perhaps being older, I don't have the fear of putting my head above the parapet that some younger people may have, who may have careers, who may have children. And I think, well, here I am, and this is my voice.
Fantastic, and it's a pleasure to give you a voice on the Middle East Report. And Jed, what's your story?
Well, my story was I actually grew up in northwest London, where there was a lot of Jewish people. In my area, you could walk to 5 synagogues. So it was a very different upbringing to Judith. Like Judith, my father was in the RAF, a pilot, and he considered himself extraordinarily British and very patriotic, and we all did in the family. And as we grew up, again, we encountered really no anti-Semitism at all. Our schools were a mixed school. I went to the local primary school, local grammar school, and really anti-Semitism didn't seem to exist. And also the other interesting thing is that in the time I grew up, most people, not just the Jewish boys and girls, but everybody was pretty supportive of Israel, and that included the left. Both of us actually, if anything, we're both left-leaning anyway, and my parents and others felt the natural place for them was in the Labour Party. They weren't active members, but that was their inclination, and that's the way they voted.
Because Judith, they're probably the natural choice for the British Jewish community in terms of their political family has always been to lean on the Labour Party. Can you explain what the traction is and the link between many in the Jewish community and actually the Labour Party itself?
Okay, well, Jed's spoken to himself about being left-leaning, but we're starting. I'm actually what I call a floating voter. Okay, so I'm a floating voter with social justice tendencies. I believe in fair play. I think that Jewish people came to this country. They were very poor. They weren't unionized. The Conservative Party was the home of the establishment, and people came in with no money, with nothing. Who was going to look after them? Who were going to be the activists? What do you think? I mean, I would say it's just always been that way. I mean, I can't say my family in Russia, has socialist tendencies, but they were rather suppressed. We pretended they weren't there when we came to England. All right. There is a story that I'm related to Trotsky, okay? Somewhere along the line.
And, and Jed as well. I mean, particularly that many Jewish people in this country have actually found the Labour Party as their home. So obviously recent developments, particularly with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, has caused a huge amount of concern for not only members of the Jewish community, but also those members of the Labour Party.
Well, it was seen that there has actually been anti-Semitism on the left, just as there has been anti-Semitism on the right. But always this was pushed into the shadows. With the coming of Jeremy Corbyn, a lot of Jewish people felt that now this is being brought into the mainstream. Whether deliberately or not, certainly a lot of people who tend to be his supporters have got anti-Zionist views, which they conflate with anti-Semitism. And even if they're not anti-Semitic themselves, the feeling of many Jewish people is that they are actually anti-Semitic, because you can't distinguish necessarily between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Many Jewish people have a lot of criticisms of the Israeli government, and I would say the huge majority want peace, a two-state solution. They want to be friends and cooperate closely with all the Palestinian peoples, in fact. And this is the dream that most Jewish people have, both here and also the great majority in Israel. And therefore it's very hard to understand why there is this attack on these views, and the fact that so many people are really anti-Israel, and therefore if you're considered to be a supporter of Israel, you are actually attacked. And we see this with the university students in particular, in academia, and with the BDS and the cultural boycott. All of these things are, for a moderate person, really beyond understanding, because it doesn't reflect the realism of the situation and what the majority of people feel.
And Judy, do you really think that maybe the problem with the Labour Party and its relationship with Israel in particular really occurred during 2014, that dreadful summer in which Hamas launched rockets and missiles into Israel, paralysing 3/4 of the entire population, and Israel had no other response than to send in the IDF and ground troops into Gaza to stop the rockets and missiles? Do you think this is where the heat fell on a lot of Labour MPs in particular? When Ed Miliband was then leader of the Labour Party, he didn't really respond to this in protecting Israel, and this is where we've seen the situation gradually get worse, because we also, in October of 2014, there was that vote in the House of Commons by many members of the Labour Party to actually recognise a unilateral Palestinian state, in which Ed Miliband endorsed.
And there was a terrible spike in 2014 during the Gaza war. I think that it was brewing under the surface. If you look at the history of left-wing anti-Zionism crossing over into anti-Semitism, it's there right from the 80s. In fact, very shortly after the 1970s, actually, right from the 1970s onwards. It had been bubbling away at the universities, and I think the university students have now reached positions which university students reach. They leave university. There was a tremendous spike then, but I think that the unwillingness of people to see the Israeli point of view and why, in essence, it was defensive, and to believe stories that have turned out not to be true. There were terrible things happen, but so many of them were gross exaggerations. I believe that the unwillingness to take on board the story, as with so much else, taps into much more ancient forms of Jew hatred than just Gaza in 2014. And that worries me no end. I don't think we'll ever do away with anti-Semitism. It's called the oldest hatred for a reason. And that's the problem. Why do people disbelieve what Israel said? Why, when you put the case to them over and over again, do they just do this to you? They say, you're not convincing me. You know, you haven't made a point.
And Jed, I mean, we saw that the Labour Party went to another defeat. The 2015 general election was led by Ed Miliband and his party. And then we saw the outsider, Jeremy Corbyn, actually against all odds, win the leadership of the Labour Party. Now, when he came to that position, many in the Jewish press, even in the mainstream media, were questioning his relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah, because there was a famous quote where he describes them as his friends. We've got a clip later to actually show that. But surely that provided the warning signs that things wouldn't be great in the party under his leadership.
Well, that's true. One did hope, though, because there was, he was the leader of a party, but there were an awful lot of people behind him on all sides, and indeed there was an attempt to oust him as a leader. One thought that the great majority of MPs in particular understood the problems that this was bringing about, and that the moderates would be able to present their views and bring balance to the party. The election in 2017, I think, has changed that, because even those who were, or many of those who were opposed to Jeremy Corbyn, realised that they now might have the possibility of winning with Jeremy Corbyn, and therefore it might be time to shut up. We shall see what's going to happen. But our project actually, and it has to be said, was to educate, if you like, or present the views of Jewish people who are supportive of Labour Party. We want there to be a strong opposition or a strong government that is both moderate and reasonable, because the democracy of this country depends on a strong opposition or a two-sided, if you like, two-sided political entity. And so the project really was to try and educate or show the Labour Party the feeling of Jewish people and how harmful we felt this was, and that the Chakrabarti inquiry itself didn't seem to really solve that problem. In fact, it said that it has become part of the problem. And the Chakrabarti inquiry, which was greeted with a great deal of optimism by many of the people within the party, as the interview showed in the film that Judith made, the biggest feeling is one of disappointment and of an opportunity missed.
Let's have a look now at Douglas Murray actually talking about the problem of anti-Semitism within the Labour movement.
The current problems of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party are just an eruption of something that everybody has known has been there for a long time. The Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has announced an inquiry, an official party-led inquiry into the party's anti-Semitism. He has appointed somebody called Shami Chakrabarti, who used to run something called Liberty, and is a sort of left-wing social campaigner, to head the inquiry. The striking thing about the Labour Party's inquiry into itself and the accusations of anti-Semitism is that it cannot possibly come up with the truth. And the reason for that is very clear, because if the Labour Party has an inquiry into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, it'll discover that the problem is at the head of the Labour Party and that the fish has rotted from the head. The Labour Party itself is now led by a man, Jeremy Corbyn, who has spent most of his political life being very cozy with some of the world's most notorious anti-Semites, some of the world's most notorious Holocaust deniers, and of course has described and constantly behaved as if the people in Hamas and Hezbollah are, as he says, his friends. These are not one-off comments, they're not things that just slipped out of his mouth, they're not niceties, they are expressions of Jeremy Corbyn's own views. During the height of this recent crisis, Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London and one of the most senior figures in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, gave an interview which got him into a lot of hot water, partly because he started talking about Hitler and which of Hitler's early policies he thought weren't so crazy and which ones were, and it's never a great position to get into. But Ken Livingstone said something absolutely fascinating in his interview which hasn't really been picked up on. He was trying to respond to the comments by Naz Shah, who had said on social media, had approved a post saying that all the Jews of Israel should be moved to America, forcibly deported to America. So Ken Livingstone said, you've got to understand this happened at a particular time in a particular context, and the context, as he explained it, was that it came during another period when the Israelis were brutally massacring the Palestinians. So he didn't say it came during a period in which Israel, after having had thousands of rockets fired into Israeli territory, led the most targeted, pinpoint, precision warfare that the world has ever seen against specific targets, even warning houses in advance of Hamas commanders that the house was going to be hit, even warning launch sites of rockets that they were going to be hit. He didn't say that. He implied that the Israelis, through sheer habit and indeed glee, just had another of their periods of randomly, brutally massacring Palestinians. And again, not Hamas commanders, not rocket launch sites, but Palestinians. That's where the Labour Party's problem is, for the time being, impossible to resolve. Because when a party is led by people who spread lies about the state of Israel, who spread lies about the only Jewish state in the world, it's not surprising if kids coming up in the party, or random members in Bradford or anywhere else, think it must be open season and that they can say what they want. Because after all, if there was a group of people who were just randomly and enjoyably massacring other people whenever they felt like it, who wouldn't step up and make themselves heard, perhaps very forcibly? So this is the Labour Party's key problem. They are trying to find out what the source of their anti-Semitism problem is, and the problem is that it comes not only from the grassroots but from the top, and the top of the Labour Party, as it currently stands, has been pushing this poison into the body politic in Britain for years. This is Douglas Murray speaking for the Gatestone Institute in London.
Douglas Murray speaking very well on the problem of anti-Semitism under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Judith, we saw there Douglas Murray, elegant as ever, and passionately putting the case forward. Now, this is the one issue that seems to be plaguing Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, the issue of anti-Semitism that won't go away. Many cases with some outrageous tweets by even some of his own Labour MPs, which can only be described as anti-Semitic or Jew hatred. How important was this report that he issued, the Chakrabarti report, in producing an inquiry that would look into the problem of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party?
First of all, I very much enjoyed Douglas Murray's piece. I just want to explain that part of the parameters for the Whitewash Project were that it would be seen to be a left-wing critique of the Labour Party, because we felt we would have no heft. We couldn't use people like Douglas Murray in it because it would be immediately thrown out of the window as discredited. Whether rightly or wrongly, I can't tell you. But that's why our project is not an attack on the Labour Party. It's an attack on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I wanted to get that absolutely straight.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then we get to the Chakrabarti inquiry. How effective was it? I think that Howard Jacobson, I've got a quote from Howard Jacobson in the book, in which he calls it stillborn. which I think that it's, we have in the film a lot of critiques about the Chakrabarty report. I could go on forever, but I think we've got Norud Salik and me actually. I actually did, I'm a literature student, and I started highlighting the bits that were about Shami, that said I. And they're all over the show, anecdotal. I've experienced this, I've done that, I've done this. I mean, I could show you this piece, it's in the film. Noru says, it's not a report. He said, my problem with it is it's not a report, it's anecdotal. Judy Weleminski says, it's admirable that it was turned around quickly because reports can moulder on for years and years and years. But this was turned around too quickly. And it started out as an inquiry into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and then was broadened out into anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. They thought that it would broaden it out, but in fact it diluted it. My particular take on the report was that Shami Chakrabarty invited submissions from groups and from individuals. I couldn't hope to redo the whole report, but I discovered through social media that there isn't one single acknowledgement of an individual submitter. I believe at a later stage, Shami Chakrabarty said that it was for reasons of confidentiality and for space. All the people I collected were asked if their reports could be used. They were never asked. Not one of my witnesses was asked if their report could be used. Reasons of space? I'm sorry, you know, it's very easy to put small type and write everybody at the end of it. I believe that the report has become part of the problem. And if I take one particular thing, if I take Ken Livingstone, maybe you're going to relate to it later, but I was waiting for that second inquiry. I was waiting to see if, when he made the analogy between Hitler and Zionists, whether he was going to be expelled from the party, because it's one of the few recommendations that Shami Chakrabarty makes, is that people who make analogies between Zionism and Nazis, people who are unrepentant have no place in the Labour Party. So that's a recommendation she made, which has been, and she hopes, she said, that the leaders will take heed of this. The leaders haven't taken heed of it. There was one other thing. It's just, I believe she uses the word whitewash at the beginning of the report. She also, but it seems to me, and then she uses in the same phrase, I hope political mischief makers won't be seen, won't criticise this. So she's automatically saying at the beginning of the report that anybody that dares to criticise it is a political mischief maker, which is interesting for somebody who stands there on a platform of free speech, is automatically trying to shut down criticism. It's a very typical thing in the anti-Zionist world to do that. It's very difficult. And then it seemed to me that the recommendations placed more emphasis on protecting people who had been accused of anti-Semitism than the people who were reporting anti-Semitism. And that bothers me no end. It leaves no mechanism. It leaves no mechanism because Labour hasn't even taken any, the leadership of Labour hasn't taken any notice of it.
I feel, just to butt in there, I think,
Yes.
I think the fact that any accusations of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party are treated as an attack on the Labour Party in an attempt to discredit it and its leadership. I think this is something that is deeply disturbing because it just doesn't allow valid argument to be considered. And I think this is one of the frightening things of the current debate, in that criticism, valid criticism, is shut down. And if you want to see the reaction to is there anti-Semitism or not, when you just see that some of the vile comments made about the film itself, that in itself is huge evidence of the anti-Semitic rhetoric that is about. Because remember, this film is not about Israel, it's about how people feel within the Labour Party, Jewish people feel within the Labour Party. And to see this vile abuse, or you look at MP sites such as, shall we say, John Mann, and you look at what goes on his page, and if anyone wants evidence of the anti-Semitism that is around and the way that is expressed from within the Labour Party, you just have to look at that.
And Jed, what was your response? I think it was back in 2016 at the Labour Party conference last year, in which Labour Friends of Israel held a meeting in which Jeremy Corbyn was invited to attend. He reluctantly attended, gave a speech, but couldn't mention the word Israel once. Oh. Now, doesn't that come under the new working definition of anti-Semitism?
Well, it comes right to the front of that, and you have to contrast that, shall we say, with the current state of how Jeremy Corbyn is willing to criticise or not criticise the leader of Venezuela. And you look at the difference between the two regimes. So one regime he's prepared to support that is not a democracy, that has taken military action against its citizens, has perverted the democracy there, and against Israel, which is a democracy and an active democracy with everybody in that country having the right to vote, and with the Arab Joint List being the third largest party in parliament, with Arab Israelis having a huge part to play in the professions, medical, legal, where they represent some of the highest positions in the legal establishment within Israel. And you just want to contrast these two, the way that these two events are spoken about, or these two countries are spoken about. And one despairs because one sees such an imbalance that it is just unimaginable in a democracy, that's all.
Absolutely. Judith, should we go and have a look at an extract of the film that you produced, which is an excellent short documentary.
It's JTV as well.
And it's produced by JTV, so let's go and have a look at this now. It's called The Whitewash Project.
Say that tomorrow evening it will be my pleasure and my honour to host an event in Parliament where our friends from Hezbollah will be speaking. I've also invited friends from Hamas to come and speak as well. The idea that an organisation that is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region should be labelled as a terrorist organisation by the British government is really a big, big historical mistake.
Jeremy Corbyn referred to people in Hamas and Hezbollah, anti-Semitic, Jew-killing organisations, as his friends. But even more alarming is that he described Hamas and Hezbollah as movements for peace, for the good of the Palestinian people, and as movements for justice. He didn't just want to talk to these friends, he positively supports their politics.
That is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice.
Now we are told that anyone who says that videos like this show that Labour has an anti-Semitism problem is part of a conspiracy to smear the left.
So here we have a situation in the Labour Party where even the most innocuous video can be used to accuse Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism.
It's also worrying how such a pathetic evidence can, and we know, can be used to intimidate Jeremy Corbyn into establishing an inquiry commission, in making daily confessions that he's not anti-Semitic, and so on.
Friends from Hezbollah, friends from Hamas, dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice.
I'm David Hirsch. I'm a member of the Labour Party and of my trade union. I read The Guardian. I teach sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London. This is my world, a world in which racism and bigotry are absolutely taboo. It is astonishing then that in this world, a fight about anti-Semitism came to a head in the spring of 2016. People like Jeremy Corbyn and Ken Livingstone had been on the fringes of the British Labour movement for decades. Hostility to Israel and common cause with the murderous enemies of Israelis functioned as key markers of their political identity. Recently, this faction took power in the party and in the unions and in the National Union of Students. Anti-Zionist activists were now in the British mainstream. And anti-Semitic things that they were saying were coming into the public domain. One Labour activist demanded the reopening of the Jewish question. Another said Jews were chief financiers of the Atlantic slave trade. A former parliamentary candidate tweeted that Hitler was the teacher of the Zionists. Labour students were baiting Jewish colleagues, singing "Bombs over Tel Aviv." And then Ken Livingstone started talking about Hitler.
Let's remember, when Hitler won his election, his policy then was that Jews should be moved to Israel. He was supporting Zionism.
The SS set up training camps so that German Jews who were going to go there could be trained to cope with a very different sort of country when they got there. When the Zionist movement asked would the Nazi government stop the rabbis doing their sermons in Yiddish and make them do it in Hebrew, he agreed to that. They passed a law that said only the Zionist flag and the swastika are the only flags that could be flown in Germany. And then, of course, they started selling Mauser pistols to the underground Jewish army. And everyone who studied history just knows this is true.
In fact, what everyone who studied history knows to be true is that Hitler wanted to murder the Jews, and Zionists wanted to save the Jews. But for decades, Livingstone has been trying to sow the anti-Semitic notion in the public imagination that Nazis and Zionists are similar and that they work together. When Jews sniff anti-Semitism, when they raise their voices against it, they are often slapped down with the response that they are doing so dishonestly, only in order to silence criticism of Israel or to smear the left. 10 years ago already, I named this slapdown the Livingstone formulation.
It wasn't me that started this nonsense. It was embittered old Blairites whipping up. Labour's got an anti-Semitism.
And we know why the smears are made. The smears are made to inhibit criticism of Israel.
In the spring of 2016, Jeremy Corbyn was in danger of being exposed as someone who tolerated anti-Semitism, or at least someone who just had no idea how to recognise it. He needed to do something about the gathering storm which threatened to derail his leadership. So he asked Shami Chakrabarti to lead an inquiry into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Tactically, it was a smart move. The storm died down while everybody waited for the report. When the report was published, there was a big silence on the central question. What was the relationship between the incidents of anti-Semitism and the politics of hostility to Israel? This film gives a voice to those who tried to help Shami Chakrabarti understand what was going on. They sent written submissions about how they experienced and made sense of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. They came away with the feeling that she didn't really want to understand. She came away with a seat in the House of Lords.
And I can highly recommend seeing the entire documentary, which is on the whitewashedproject.com. I have to commend you very much, Judith, because it's an excellent documentary you produced. It's easy to watch. It's 25 minutes, very informative, but really does highlight one of the major problems is that it seems like the values within the Labour Party have shifted so much in recent years that they don't reflect the historical connection between the Labour movement in Israel, which helped to found the modern state of Israel, and that with the values within the Parliamentary Labour Party now?
That's a very interesting question, because if you look at the report and you hear people who defend Labour's record, the people that are out and out to defend and say there's no anti-Semitism are usually the ones who are themselves promulgating anti-Zionist views. And they always state their case by looking at Labour's traditional history and how inclusive it's been towards the Jews. I would say that the Jews have always been drawn to Labour because of the values within the Jewish religion, which are about social justice and fairness. But when the Labour Party starts resting on its history it's also encompassing an unwillingness to look at what they're doing right here and now. And yes, there's Labour. There's Labour in Israel. There's the leader of Labour in Israel. When Jeremy Corbyn became leader, he invited him to Israel. The leader of the left in Israel invited him, and he didn't so much as answer the invitation, although Jeremy Corbyn has a history of not answering emails. I believe there was an article in the Sunday Times. We thought it was just personal, but I believe some months ago there were thousands upon thousands of unanswered emails in Jeremy Corbyn's office. That was in the Sunday Times. It makes me wonder about how efficient Jeremy Corbyn actually is. So there's just a growing disparity, and I really worry about people who are seen as the underdog. I look at the numbers of Jews in this country. I look at the Jewish vote. I wonder how much of it is really from conscience, and I wonder how much of it is because people are playing to another vote. And I'm going to say, how many Labour MPs are playing to the Muslim vote because they feel that there is out there an anti-Zionist vote? I'm not demonising Muslims. I believe there are many, many good Muslims out there. We only have to look at somebody like Naz Shah. I'm a great believer in education, who came out with something on her Facebook page. And when she was spoken to, she realised that she had grown up with unexamined assumptions and was willing to take on board what she had learned and change her mind, and has become a great champion. How many other Muslims are there out there that if we could only reach out and educate them would understand? But in the meantime, they're being played by some of the MPs who, I believe, promulgate a politics of hate. And as Jed said earlier, we don't hate the Palestinians. I'm sure that most Palestinians don't hate Israeli Jews either. Arabs and Jews, if you see them on the ground level, they can be friends. So yes, we need to educate, and that's why something like this is such a good programme to do, to say that the Labour Party talks about smears. I believe that ordinary, moderate people on all sides of the divide, and I hate to call it a divide, but it is, I think that moderates are not being spoken for. I call myself passionately moderate, and I would like to give a voice to other moderates, because you get the people on this side screaming, you get the people on that side screaming, and you don't feel you can join in with anybody, because there's nobody that speaks for you, that wants peace, and that believes in a two-state solution if there was only somebody to negotiate with on both sides. I mean, who do we have? We have Abbas, we have Netanyahu, whatever you think of either of them. These are the two people who are there. I'd like to bang both their heads together and say, speak to each other.
But isn't this probably, Judith's probably hit the actual real, got the real nutshell of the actual problem, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that is that the Israelis and the Jewish nation itself is desperate for peace after 5 major wars, desperate to be accepted in the Middle East, and yet her opponents want to see her destruction, have never come to terms with her and recognising the Jewish right to live in her ancient homeland. Isn't that the crux of the problem? And that's also the major problem with the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. He was president of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, so believes very much a lot of these lies that are directed against Israel.
Well, I think the problem is that in order to negotiate peace with Israel, you have to have a standing that is really bulletproof, literally. And even with Sadat who made this great effort, with Begin, who was seen as an extreme right wing, but in fact, because Begin came from that part of the electoral right, and his credentials were so strong, he was actually seen to be able, if he said we could make a peace with Egypt, it was acceptable. But of course, Sadat was assassinated eventually. And this is the big problem, that the recognition of the benefit for all of a true and lasting peace would just be enormous. But there are too many other people who really don't want this. They want to continue to propagate dissent, terrorism, and so on. And really, it is these motives that have to be questioned in a world which actually needs a little bit of common sense.
Absolutely.
Could I just bring this back to home?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it might seem we've strayed away from anti-Semitism, which is what people don't understand always with great clarity, how this affects the Jews in Britain and in the diaspora. It's basically, I think a survey recently showed that 90% of Jews in Britain believe in Israel's right to exist under a very broad umbrella. Therefore, when we see Israel, we in Britain see Israel attacked, we become targets for that in Britain. We stand up. There's a lot of anger, which is, for whatever reason, I believe a lot of it is stirred up by people who have no interest in peace whatsoever. When you see talks in universities being interrupted violently, when you see what's going on now with the Shalom Festival in Edinburgh, where the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Committee is trying to stop this festival, is telling people they have blood on their hands if they go and see something, we become the targets because we identify with Israel's right to exist, warts and all right? And therefore, that's why anti-Zionism becomes the interface between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I wanted to make that clear.
No, I think you made that clear, and I think that's a very important point to actually make, and this is major part of the problem.
Yes.
But also, isn't political correctness one of the other major problems, because we can't really address the major problem. And the major problem of Jew hatred today is the anti-Semitism within the Muslim community. That's been imported from the Middle East into Europe and into Britain, and to an extent that they're actually dealing with it because they're actually afraid to deal with it. And until we actually stop a lot of these imams preaching against hatred to Israel, destruction against Israel, this is in so much of their teaching and what they're being fed on a diet through the internet, and where it all stems from in the Middle East, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually eradicate this problem.
It's so hard because I'm so worried about talking about a whole group of people. It worries me no end. But I look at the shopkeeper, was it in Scotland?
Yes, up in Glasgow.
Somebody travelled from Bradford and assassinated him because he belonged to a Muslim sect that believed in talking to all, in being more open to the world. It seems to me that at the moment, I think it's Islamism, is a totalitarian form of Islam, which it's rather as though they're in thrall much as the Russians were in thrall under Stalin, or the Germans were in thrall under Hitler. And it's very, very difficult for moderates to find a voice, even without the unexamined attitudes, which may in some cases be mild. But it's very hard when they're threatened, when they have members of their own family. It's very hard to find the moderates, and I believe they're there. I believe with all my heart that they're there.
Absolutely. And we're coming shortly to the end of the programme, so I think we need to kind of sum up, really. Jed, one of the issues as well that concerns me profoundly, and this is with Jeremy Corbyn himself, is that during the election, after the horrendous terrorist attack we saw in Manchester Arena, Jeremy Corbyn, only a couple of days later, gave his foreign policy speech in which he said that attack was actually justified because this was a response of British foreign policy in the Middle East without actually looking at the ideology of ISIS and those who carried it out, who want to establish an Islamic caliphate and bring the world under an Islamic system.
Well, it's really quite extraordinary when you look back, shall we say, at the Arab Spring, which I think was naively welcomed when it is true that some of the dictatorships were brought down, but the replacement is pure anarchy. And when one looks at the actual reality of trying to displace with a popular movement, you can say that this was the start of ISIS. You can say that that a lot of the problems that have come into Europe through Syria and whatever are all part of a huge and multinational political naivety that I find terribly difficult to understand, except that there is an excess of optimism over realism. And that is it. And then to blame democracies, I mean, part of the problem was with the labor movement is the belief that Israel is a colonial state, and therefore is part of our colonial history that has brought this trouble, and that the enemies are the United States and Israel and anyone else who is considered to be a democracy brought about by a historical colonial regime. And it is, how shall I put it, selective. This brings about a false history. And the political correctness that you mentioned before is a symptom of this as well.
Absolutely. Judith, only down to a couple of minutes. I really want to paint the picture now that Jeremy Corbyn did extremely well in the last general election that we had. Political momentum is with him now. And what are the dangers for him if he what is the dangers for the Jewish community if he becomes Prime Minister? And also, what's the future for Anglo-Israeli relations if he's in charge of British foreign policy?
Right, I just want quickly to say that Jeremy Corbyn is the head of Labour and he has certain cohorts behind him, but there are still very good people within the Labour Party.
Absolutely.
I don't want to be seen as demonising the Labour Party. We've got John Mann, we've got Ian Austin, we've got a number of people.
And Louise Ellman, who does a
And
fantastic
Louise Ellman, yes, and who's Joan Ryan, who is, yes. I mean, they're all marvellous. And there is, actually, I mean, I'm sorry I'm changing the subject slightly, but there is a rift in the Jewish community whether people should leave or whether people should stay in the Labour Party. And it's quite bitter. There have been quite a lot of arguments about this. So I don't want to demonise the whole Labour Party because it's completely unfair. But Jeremy Corbyn, what would he be for the Jewish people if he got into power? I think with the microcosm of the macrocosm, what would he be for Britain if he got into power? He can't run, he doesn't answer his emails. You know, he doesn't seem to think straight about any sort of issue. We went up to campaign for John Mann in Basset Law. We met soldiers. He demonises our army. They don't like him one bit either. So it would be a bad thing for the country. Not Labour, but Jeremy Corbyn's Labour would be a terrible thing for Britain. It would be a disaster.
Can I just add one? We were in France recently, yeah, and nearly 10% of the Jewish population have left France over the last 10 years. A terrible thing because of where they see their own safety and safe being. And we were talking to a member of the House of Deputies there, and he was also the local mayor. He was in Bergerac, and he didn't know we were Jewish, didn't know we had any connection. He was saying to the friends of ours, what are we going to do? How are we going to be able to stop Jewish people leaving this country? And the frightening thing is I would not really want that to be replicated in the United Kingdom, because I think people should stay here and fight for what we believe in.
Absolutely.
But it gives an idea of what would happen in those circumstances, or could happen in those circumstances.
Jed and Judith, I just want to thank you so much for being my guests on today's Middle East Report, and well done with this book. This book is called The Whitewashed. There's also a documentary. You can go on to their website, which is called whitewashed.co.uk, to actually watch the programme. So I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. These are serious issues that we're discussing. Judith mentioned, for example, her father and the time she grew up. There was no anti-Semitism in this country, and now there's a major problem in our society with anti-Semitism, and we know that this will infect society and this will have devastating impact upon Britain and its future relations with Israel. So let's continue to hold Israel up on our prayers and also stand with the Jewish people during this very difficult time.
no, no, no. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was. For 2,000 years the Jews all roamed, but we always called Israel our home. Unlike the British and Dutch who came to South Africa where they had no claim. They already had countries overseas, but they wanted to expand with new colonies, so they conquered the natives, bought and sold their land they stole full of diamonds and gold. The whites united and decided to create South Africa as a democratic state, but soon they denied blacks voting rights, so the whole government was controlled by whites. The House and the Senate and all of the courts were white, so the black people got no support. Plus the police would arrest and beat any peaceful protesters in the street. They divided everybody into 4 different races, moved them by force into separate places. So if you were Indian, black or brown, you had no business in no white town. They had segregation of transportation, buses, bus stops, trains and train stations, separate ambulance, different doctor and nurse, and the black hospitals were always worse. Restaurants, hotels, and the public park might be off limits if your skin was dark. It was a crime, and you could get more than a fine if you crossed the line of that whites only sign. They had separate teachers at different schools, black and white beaches and swimming pools, cafes and movie theaters wouldn't let folks in, discriminating if they had the wrong color skin. No mixed marriage, it was a criminal act for a white person to have sex with a black. Apartheid went from the womb till the tomb, couldn't even take a dump in the same bathroom. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was. In Israel, apartheid is not the case, cause regardless of gender, religion, or race, all Israeli citizens, black, brown, and white, have equal social and political rights. So the Arab Israeli population, which makes up 20% of the nation, might be a minority, but at least they can vote, unlike the rest of the Middle East. Look at the whole region, you'll see only Israel is truly a democracy, where every citizen's right to vote is protected and Arab officials often get elected. That's an important point, let me stress it. There's a dozen Arabs with seats in the Knesset, plus an Arab judge on the Supreme Court, so they don't fall short on government support. Everyone has access to the same schools, same beaches and the same swimming pools, the same resorts and hotel guest rooms, same public parks and public restrooms, same cinemas, restaurants, cafes, same trains, buses, taxis, and highways, same doctors and nurses. All deliveries of babies are done in the same facilities. Arab Israeli life expectancy's great, up by 27 years since 1948, and their infant mortality rates have declined from 32 per thousand to less than 9, and they're doing much better economically relative to every other Arab country. There's no restriction on choice of career. They're welcome in the military if they volunteer. They can work and reside wherever they please, from Eilat all the way to the Sea of Galilee. They live in the very same cities as Jews, on the same street, in the same house if they choose. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was.